Good morning. Welcome to Wake Up with Ashland. My name is Eric Brooks. I am the curator here at Ashland, and it's great to be with you this morning. It's a beautiful day in the bluegrass, beginning of fall. Hope you are well and staying safe. I'm glad you could join us today. As it happens, we're entering the month of September, which I learned recently is Bourbon Heritage Month. I think we can all agree that that's an important month in the bluegrass. Of course, bourbon is the signature beverage of the bluegrass, so we thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about that and talk about Henry Clay's love for bourbon, and he did enjoy a good bourbon. We have some really interesting artifacts in the collection, so we're glad to be able to do that. I'm pleased to have Ken, my camera guy, here to assist again. Once again, we continue to evolve the process, and I think it gets better each time, so I'm really thankful to have Ken and thankful for the sponsor who is supporting that. So that's a big assistance to me. So I hope that makes a difference and you enjoy the presentation that much more because he's here. So we're glad of that. Now, once again, I also want to remind you that the artifacts we're going to talk about today, you can find more about them, see pictures, etc., by going to our website, henryclay.org. Clicking on the Learn tab at the top, the bottom thing when the drop-down menu comes up is the collection catalog. Click that, you'll see our catalog homepage. Scroll down until you see the folder labeled Wake Up With Ashland. There you'll find these artifacts. I put all the artifacts I talk about each week in that folder. So check it out. You can look at them more, and obviously if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, ebrooks@henryclay.org or whatever. So, to start today, I have a story that I discovered some time ago that appeared in the newspaper in the 1830s that is a really great Henry Clay bourbon story. And it captures who Clay was and is a great way to talk about bourbon and Kentucky. I'm going to start with this thing right here. That obviously isn't a bourbon bottle. That's a wine bottle. This particular wine bottle was actually found in an outbuilding here at Ashland in the 1940s, maybe early 50s, by a young man, a child who lived here in the neighborhood. He had come up here to play, and apparently the outbuildings weren't locked, and so he took that as license to go look around and play around, and he found this bottle and thought it was really cool, so he took it home and saved it. And then a few years ago, he came in and said, I probably shouldn't have done that, but I'd like to donate the bottle. So he donated the bottle and a really nice silver spoon that he found at the same time. So we're thankful for that. If you've ever found things at Ashland, we'd love to know what they are. Hear about them and potentially add them to our collection. So you can contact me about that. But the importance of the bottle is that the story I'm going to tell you involves both bourbon and wine. So the story is that Henry Clay received 3 bottles of a wine called Constantine. I don't know much about that wine. I didn't really look it up, but it's apparently a type of wine. This wine was manufactured by a group of Swiss folks who lived in a place called Vevey, Indiana. Now, the leader of that community was a man named John Jacob Dufour. John Jacob Dufour was a Swiss man who had migrated originally to central Kentucky. In fact, he moved to Jessamine County where he opened the first commercial winery in the United States. So we have that claim to fame in addition to bourbon. That winery, there's actually a winery there today called First Vineyard on that site. It's not the same winery, but there is a winery there taking advantage of that heritage. The winery didn't work out really well. The French grapes he was growing didn't do well there, and he ended up selling that off, and he took his people and they moved to Indiana, where they made this Constantine wine. They gave Henry Clay 3 bottles. And in fairly short order, he consumed 2 of them. I don't mean he sat down and drank 2 straight bottles of wine. Certainly Henry Clay liked to drink, and there are a plethora of stories about him consuming and having a great time. I should note that there are no real evidence to suggest that he had a problem with alcohol or that he couldn't function, but he certainly liked to have a good time. But in this case, he drank 2 bottles over a period of time, and they were really great. So he decided he wanted to save the 3rd bottle for something really special. So he puts it away in his basement in the wine cellar in a secure location, and eventually he's ready to head to Washington, so he packs up the bottle to take with him to serve at some event in Washington. Now, that's a long, arduous journey. It takes about 2 weeks at that time in a carriage. So he works really hard to make sure it gets there safely. Sometimes that means carrying it in his lap. And that also means he has to resist the temptation over those 2 weeks to pop the cork and drink the wine, which he does. When he gets to D.C., he puts it aside, and eventually there's a big diplomatic event at the White House. So he takes the bottle out, he takes it to the White House, he gives it off to a White House steward who puts it away to be consumed at a later point in the evening. Eventually, he and President James Madison and a man named William Wirt, a fellow politician, sit down, and glasses are brought, wine bottle is brought out. Wine steward at the White House pops the cork. He pulls up 3 glasses. Henry and President Madison and Mr. Wirt begin to drink. And immediately Henry gets a really strange and rather worried look on his face. And at the same time, Mr. Wirt says, I don't think this is wine. I think this is whiskey. And Henry Clay, being extremely agile of mind, says, well, of course, that's what we call fine wine in Kentucky. So he plays it off. They have a good laugh. They drink the whiskey, which is actually pretty good, and enjoy it. But he's still left with the mystery of how did whiskey get in his wine bottle? Well, eventually he goes back home and is dining with the family, and he brings up this incident when his son Theodore looks at him and says, well, Father, I have to confess, that's my fault. Tom is Theodore's brother, younger brother, and I were down in the basement in the wine cellar and got thirsty and thinking, you had said this wine was so spectacular, we wanted to know about that. So we started to drink it. And the next thing we know, half the bottle is gone. And we thought, oh, we're going to be in big trouble. So I guess we better do something to hide this fact. So they did. They filled the bottle with bourbon, corked it, made it look like it had never been opened, put it back on the shelf, and snuck off. So that's how Henry Clay served a bottle of whiskey, of bourbon, in Washington to the president as fine Kentucky wine. So the next time you go to a party with your friends, you can serve your bourbon in wine glasses and refer to it, as Clay did, as fine Kentucky wine. Now, many people ask, what bourbon did Clay drink? Well, not all of the bourbon that exists today existed then, for sure. If you're familiar with LeBrow and Graham in Woodford County, that's a bourbon distillery that's been around a really long time, and Clay did buy bourbon there. He is also associated with a brand called Old Crow, which was made initially by a man named Oscar Pepper. And that brand continued to be made from Clay's time all the way into the 20th century. And eventually, they created advertising to play on the fact that he drank this brand of bourbon. And so in the 40s and 50s, they print hundreds of ads featuring Henry Clay and other famous political figures, and we have several in our collection. So here's one for Old Crow. This particular ad features Henry Clay welcoming William Henry Harrison here at Ashland, and he did in November of 1840. Harrison had been elected president and stopped here on the way to Washington and had a nice dinner with Clay. We actually have an invite to that dinner in the collection. So you can see that here. This ad, which is from a bigger magazine, obviously, shows Henry Clay and Daniel Webster toasting, with Old Crow, of course, the great Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale. If you've seen The Greatest Showman, you'll be familiar with Jenny Lind. So those are just incidents that they want you to believe Old Crow was served at. Was it? Well, we don't really know, but it's a good idea. And there were lots of these, and they were apparently pretty successful. Now, this brand no longer exists. I believe it ceased to be produced maybe in the 70s, certainly by the early 80s. So it's no longer a brand that you can buy. There are brands that you can buy that relate. This is one. This brand is called Old Henry Clay Whiskey. This was also a pepper brand. It was originally a distillery called the Henry Clay Distillery, which opened in about 1869 down in what is today the Distillery District downtown on Manchester Street. There was a fire and it closed a few years later, and the distillery was purchased by a man named James E. Pepper. James E. Pepper eventually got it going again, and they produced 2 brands of whiskey. This is one of them. This brand was produced by 1880 and continued to be produced right up until about 1914 or so. And then it went out of production, and that distillery closed in the early 20th century. So that's a really old bottle. That's an original from the days when they first produced it. You can see it's got a cork instead of a screw top or other kind of top, keeping it closed. You can see it's got Clay's picture on it. And this is actually a rye whiskey, so this isn't really a true bourbon, but it's one of the brands that they drank, and they're using Henry Clay again to sell that. Now, if you like that, you can buy it today. This is a modern bottle, which I added to our collection. I collected this from one of the bars at our summer lawn party one year, so we served it here. This is made by the James E. Pepper Distillery, which is now operating again in the same location. This can be purchased in a variety of locations. I think you can get it at Total Wine. Look it up on the internet. If you put that in, Old Henry Clay whiskey, a whole bunch of things will come up where you can purchase it. So that's a brand that you can have. This is another whiskey. This is not a specifically Henry Clay whiskey, but we actually had a barrel made up of this, set aside of this, and then poured into bottles as a fundraiser. And this is something that a lot of different entities are doing now as a way to raise funds. And you can see here, it's got our logo on it and some of the information about it. So that's our mixture. Now, Clay had a lot of ways to serve bourbon here at Ashland. A lot of devices for that, some of which are really quite fancy. This is a liqueur set. This is called a Tantalus. This was meant for use in a carriage. Clay's journey to Washington, as I said previously, would take 2 weeks or more. And so having a drink along the way was a way to pass that time more easily and perhaps more comfortably. You can see all the little glasses fit into this metal framework along with the 4 decanters so that everything is held in place and doesn't go all over the place as you travel. This is a remarkable piece of equipment. This one was Henry Clay's. So he might have carried bourbon in it, more likely for something like this. Probably sherry, port, sangria, Madeira, things of that nature, liqueurs. But, again, he liked bourbon. He took it to Washington, so he may very well have utilized this. This is a bottle from our collection that has Clay on it. Blown glass. His image is blown on one side. The other side features Daniel Webster. Now, we think this bottle dates to 1832, when they flirted with a run for the presidency as president and vice president. Clay was running for the presidency, Webster for the vice presidency. And the idea was they produced these, would fill them with bourbon and hand them out at campaign rallies and things. What better way to get votes than to lubricate the election process? So we actually have 2 of these in the collection. There are several other bottles that feature Clay that are of a similar nature. Most of them actually have Washington on the obverse, or on the reverse rather. So this is the more unusual of the ones that are out there. This is a decanter that belonged to Henry Clay. This is extremely beautiful. We actually have a number of these in the collection that belong to Clay. We believe they were made by the Bakewell Glass Company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a very well-known, very high-end producer of exquisite pressed glass. You can see it's got the mushroom stopper. So imagine that sitting on the table. You're playing cards with Clay or having a conversation, doing legal business, and he can serve you bourbon right out of his decanter, which sits in his coaster. This is a silver coaster with a wooden bottom. There's Clay's signature right there, engraved on it. These belong to Clay. These actually appear in one of his descendants' wills, so that's how we know that. Now, this design is replicated from or based on coasters in the collection at Mount Vernon that belonged to George Washington. So they have a very distinguished history. We have a pair of these in the collection, and this one sits in the coaster. This usually sits on the chess table because as a chess player, I can tell you, it makes the game much more interesting to have a decanter of bourbon there nearby. Now, this is a flask. Many of you probably have this piece of equipment. You may take this to sporting events, that sort of thing. This one belonged to Henry Clay's son, John, and it's got Clay engraved on it. On the other side is a very lovely thistle, very attractive. This may have belonged to Henry Clay. We aren't sure. There's no maker's mark on the bottom or otherwise, so we don't know when it was made. But John was a horseman, spent a lot of time at the track, racing and whatnot, and would carry this with him when he went. Now, eventually his wife sort of weaned him away from that because alcohol had become a problem for him. But nonetheless, he carried this on the track, and it has a really unique feature. I'll unscrew the lid here, try to get this off. So you can see the lid screws off. Now, many of you would probably take your swig right out of the flask, and that's fine. You can certainly do that. But if you want to be more civilized, whoop, instant whiskey shot. right there. All you got to do is telescope it out, and it becomes its own little glass. And I think that's pretty sweet. You got to like that. Handy way of having a drink on the fly. Now, when you talk about bourbon, of course, one of the preferred ways to consume it in Kentucky is the mint julep. Now, obviously, we've all had that at Derby time and whatever, sort of our signature state drink. And of course, Henry Clay had mint juleps. They were around in his time. We have every reason to believe that he would have consumed them. There are even recipes attributed to Henry Clay. If you go to the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., and go to the Round Robin Bar there at the Willard, you speak to the bartender. There's a bartender there that's been there for many, many years and knows the story very well. He will tell you that Henry Clay introduced the mint julep to Washington at the Willard Hotel in the bar, and that they have a recipe they believe to be the recipe he used. Now, I have done a lot of searching for a Henry Clay mint julep recipe, and there may be one, but I haven't found it. There is no recipe that exists in his hand or in any document created by, say, a descendant who says this is Dad's recipe or Grandpa's recipe or whatever. So we don't know for sure what his recipe was. We do have mint julep glasses and cups in the collection. These are also referred to as beakers. I have 3 pulled here. This one belonged to a pair of Henry Clay's granddaughters, Rose Victoire Clay, daughter of Henry Clay's son Thomas, and her sister Miriam Gratz Clay. They're both engraved on here. This is 1856. This one was made by a silversmith by the name of Garner, E.G. Garner, who worked by himself. He also worked with a man named Winchester here locally. This one, I think is, well, this is the one that has Henry Clay engraved on it. This is a later engraving. This was not done during Clay's time, I don't think. But it is coin silver, and I think dates to his time and descended in the family. Yeah, this is a Garner and Winchester. So this dates really before this one. This is probably 1840s. This is one that not only belonged to Henry Clay, but it's monogrammed HLC for Henry and Lucretia Clay. So we think these might have been an anniversary gift or something like that. There are a set of these that were at least 6. They were scattered throughout the family after Henry Clay died. This is the one that we have in our collection. There are others in family collections, etc. So this is a set that we know that Henry Clay used. And this set is by a man named C.A. Barnett. Clay had a number of pieces of silver from Barnett, and I think he was in Alexandria, Virginia. So probably purchased when he was up in Washington. But there, we have some very, very, very lovely julep cups here at Ashland. We don't serve mint juleps in them, of course, but we do sell julep cups in the museum store, and you can get those engraved, etc. So check out our website and visit the museum store to learn more. So, as you can see, Henry Clay was a bourbon aficionado. One of the things that is often attributed to him is a quote that he took bourbon to Washington to lubricate the wheels of government, which I think probably was a good idea. So anyway, it's a fascinating story and a great story to be able to share at this time of the year when it's Bourbon Heritage Month. So there you go. I mean, you can try and enjoy bourbon, have a mint julep, or maybe have an old Henry Clay whiskey, whatever suits your fancy. I'll be glad to take any questions if there are any.
Did they make bourbon here at Ashland?
So there were always bourbon barrels here. He bought bourbon and brought it here. There was never, as far as we know, a distillery right on the property. Clay never owned a distillery or distilled his own whiskey. There is evidence in very early land records that perhaps before Henry Clay bought property here, that over near Clay Spring and Mansfield, over near where Shriners Hospital is, there actually was a distillery. Now, I don't know of any evidence of it that remains, but Clay Spring, which is, if you come off Richmond Road on Chenaway and make your first left, that's Clay Spring Road. It eventually makes a turn, and right where it makes a turn is a little park, and there's a spring there. And that spring could have easily fed a distillery, provided water to make the bourbon, etc. So, could have been, but the evidence for that is somewhat apocryphal. There is some evidence in documents, but it's not clear exactly where it was or I don't think it lasted very long. It was probably very large.
Do you know where the kids got the bourbon to refill the?
Well, I would assume that he had a barrel of it in the basement, and that it was something that the boys could get to conveniently. You know, if they had taken wine out of another bottle, now you've just moved the problem. You haven't really hidden it. So I guess they figured, well, by the time anyone figures that out, we'll be far away and it won't be a big deal. Well, they had no idea that dear old dad would give that bottle to the President of the United States. So, oh well. Henry Clay's boys got into a lot of mischief, and that was just one of any number of incidents that they were involved with.
Did Henry Clay serve mint juleps?
We don't really know. That's a good question. Again, I've done some research on this. I have never found a recipe in his hand. I don't recall ever having seen a reference, for example, to serving them here at Ashland. So he may have. I mean, like I say, they are known to have existed in that time period, and I think it likely he would have known about them. And I think it's reasonable to believe that he did, but I don't have a hard piece of data that I can point at that proves that fact.
And this is probably a little off topic, but was Keeneland around at that point in time?
Was who?
Keeneland?
No.
They didn't.
Keeneland opened in 1936, I believe. Clay actually had one of the first tracks here in Kentucky, and I'll come back to this probably in October during racing season. But before Keeneland, there was a track called the Kentucky Association Track, which, if you know where Race Street is, that's why it's called Race Street. There was a track right there. And that's what preceded Keeneland. It started operating, I think, in the early 1820s and operated up until 1932 or 3. And then it closed down as the city was growing and they moved out to Keeneland.
This might be an off-topic question, but did Henry Clay or anyone to your knowledge use bourbon to strip paint off of?
I have no knowledge of him using it to strip paint or anything like that. I would imagine that it would do that, or strip finish on a floor or whatever. There in the family, there's a piece of furniture that has a stain that is supposed to be a stain created when Henry Clay spilled cod liver oil or something like that on it. So who knows? I mean, we could have things. We don't know how the stain got there, but the stain could have come from bourbon. That's certainly quite possible. Well, thank you again for tuning in. It's always a great pleasure to be able to share these things with you and to spend the time we get to spend doing this. And I'll be back again, like I say, if not before, in October to talk about horse racing as we enter the racing season. And I have some things planned in November for Veterans Day. So we'll look forward to that. Everyone have a great day. Stay safe, be well, and we'll see you again soon.